आर्यन होम्योपैथिक एकेडमी में आपका स्वागत है। मैं हूं डॉक्टर आर्यन। डॉक्टर सैमुअल हैनीमैन की लाइफ और उनके कार्य के श्रृंखला में आइए आगे बढ़ें। In this video, we will talk about the Farewell to Leipzig by Hahnemann. From this time onward, Hahnemann gave two great works to the world, work on chronic diseases and his writing on cholera. Hahnemann carried on his medical activities not merely to ensure a living for his family and for himself, but also, above all, to test, observe and extend his theories of the treatment of patients. That was the higher conception of his healing science, which he always kept in sight. Hahnemann then appealed to Duke Ferdinand of Anhalt-Köthen for permission to settle down in Köthen, a place, a little town, although segregated in rural retirement and away from busy traffic, was yet not too far from the center of German intellectual life. Duke agreed to Hahnemann's demand that not only settle down as doctor in Köthen, but he allowed to prepare his own medicines and further the right to enable him to administer these self-prepared medicine without the intervention of apothecaries. His desire being granted, Hahnemann could formally and completely terminate his stay in Leipzig. In June 1821, he left Leipzig. Several of his students accompanied Hahnemann for a certain distance and two traveled with him to Köthen. One of them was Dr. Mosdorf, who later became his son-in-law. Although it is said that Hahnemann's stay in Köthen was peaceful and undisturbed happiness filled in his work, this is a serious mistake. More and more violent attacks on him and on his system succeeded one another continuously. But no longer these attacks injured him mentally or led him to stray. No longer he had to reply personally to reproaches, distortions, and calumnies. He merely passed them to his pupil like staff and others to reply. In these replies, even to those who were acknowledged professor of academic repute and from the profession like Puflens or Springel, professor of medicine in Hales University, or Heinmoth, professor of psychiatry in Leipzig University, or Dr. Baron von Wedeking, professor in University of Darmstadt, got treated with most amazing disrespect. His replies were most irrelevant and incompatible with the queries and the objection raised in them. As opposed to the manifold, pitful and nagging attacks on Hahnemann and his theory, it is pleasant to note what a distinguished and dignified position Pufland took up in his public attitude to homeopathy at that time. Pufland defended and justified that actual practice of homeopathy is such a nature that it afforded the fullest scope to the natural power of healing. The advantages of homeopathy, in his own words, are it will attract attention of all important questions of individualization. It will help to bring dietetics back to its own. It will prohibit large doses of medicine. It will lead to a simplification of prescription. It will lead to more accurate testing and determination of the effect of remedies on the living subject, as it has to a certain extent already done. It was in Köthen, in his beautiful house, that the greater part of his work on chronic diseases is said to have been written. Here, Hahnemann adhered to a strict timetable for his work and recreation. Apart from seeing large number of patients coming from far off far and wide places, his constant writing and reading habits, he found ample time to meet his friends and colleagues and enjoy and entertain them with a glass of mild beer and himself smoking from his long Turkish pipe and making disappearing clouds of tobacco smoke in the evening hours. In connection with the Cothen period of Hahnemann, question of fees he was charging also came in discussion of many colleagues, and some criticized him for charging exorbitant fees. Hahnemann graduated his fees according to the wealth or wages of their patient, so that the rich have to pay for the poor. Hahnemann, in the true spirit of the Freemason, had always a warm heart for the really poor and needy, and that his hand was ever ready to give without requiring recompense. Poor patients came in the same consulting hours, enjoyed the same rights and the rich as the rich patient. They were always taken in their turn. After all, who will blame him for demanding payment consistent with his art? He had passed through severe privations in his youth. In the earlier period of his professional career, he had experienced stern struggles in the quest for food and the battle of life. He had therefore learned the tyranny of poverty and the necessity of a definite income and capital to ensure a comfortable but by no means luxuriant existence. Men who had passed through such a pool of need arrived necessarily at economy and heightened sense of the earning capacity possible to them. Chronic diseases, that is, the Sora theory in the year 1828 was the last work of fundamental importance of Hahnemann. It is true that his homeopathic system offered, as Hahnemann himself stated, far more certain, more convenient and less harmful remedies than allopathy for acute diseases, for epidemic diseases, sporadic fevers and venereal disease. But the number of tiresome diseases yet in the wide world was incomparably greater, and in spite of all homeopathic experiments, they were still uncured. The treatment of all such diseases was, even when carried out strictly in accordance with the theory of homeopathic science, as hitherto practiced, encouraging in the beginning, less favorable in the continuation, and hopeless in the end. Therefore, Hahnemann writes further, and I quote, during the years 1816 and 1817, I have been employed day and night with the very serious problem of finding out why all the medicines known to homeopathy bring about no real cure in diseases under discussion and of securing. If possible, a clearer insight into the true state of those thousands of stricken ones who remain uncured in the face of unimpeachable truth of homeopathic system of healing. Lo, in this time, the giver of all good things suffered me to solve the sublime riddle of mankind's good as a result of incessant thought, tireless investigation, accurate observation, and the most careful experiments. These are Hahnemann's words in the first part of his last considerably medical work, Chronic Diseases, Their Nature and Homeopathic Treatment. First edition by Arnold Resden and Leipzig in 1823. Second edition came in 1835 to 1839. In the footnote, Hahnemann also added, and I quote, "Yet of all these indescribable labor, I did not so much as breathe a word either to the world in general or to my student. This was not perchance because the ingratitude frequently shown me restrained me. Unquote. No, I did not breathe a word of it because it is improper and even injurious to speak and write of immature things. Only in the last year have I communicated the main facts to two of my students who have done most meritorious service on behalf of homeopathy. This was for their good and that of their patients, and that the whole of this scientific knowledge should not be lost to the world in the event of a higher call into eternity before the completion of my book, which was not improbable in my 73rd year. That is what Hahnemann writes, and I unquote. The two students of whom Hahnemann here spoke were Dr. Staff of Naumburg, the editor of the first ever journal in homeopathy, Archives of the Homeopathic Science, and the other was Dr. Gross of Jutterberg, the co-publisher of that journal. These two doctors, who stood nearest to his heart and who had penetrated further into his new system of healing. Consequently, Hahnemann kept his new discoveries to himself for several years, making use of them only in his own practice and according to his own story, achieving eminent and remarkable cures in cases where formerly his known well-chosen remedies have failed. At last, when his intuition gained by inexhaustible investigation had become certainty to himself, when these new views and ideas seemed to be sufficiently matured, he determined on their communication to others, on their written disposition in a well-ordered form. His old publisher, Arnold of Dresden, undertook the publication of the work. The first edition consists of 4 parts in all, the second of 5. Part 1 contains the general theoretical principles of the new theory about chronic diseases. Part 2 and Part 4 and some part of Part 5 contain a detailed presentation of the most important antistoric remedies. Few books have stirred up excitement in the medical world than Hahnemann's chronic diseases. His conception of these diseases, in particular his Cholera theory, arose the criticism of friends and foe to a tremendous extent from the very moment of their publication. At this point, many of his adherents and students refused to follow him any further. Before the publication of chronic diseases, Hahnemann had written to Dr. Staff, and I quote, "They will require more than 6 months before they recover from the fright and astonishment of this enormous, preposterous affair, and they will perhaps need another 6 months before they will believe in it. It will therefore probably be 3 years before they can make any sensible use of it." That is what Hahnemann says about chronic diseases. It all happened as professed, and even worse. Even those from whom he might have expected the greatest understanding were surprised and confused by the novel vigor of the ideas, the illimitable horizon of possibility which were here opened up. Others rejected from the start either the causality of each to the extent asserted by Hahnemann, or the medicine in such high dilution as was hitherto unheard of, or both, though it has remained not merely for a year as Hahnemann had predicted, but until the present day, nearly more than 2 centuries afterward. Medical officer Dr. Burkhardt, homeopathic physician in Berlin, expressed his views as under, and I quote, "What we nowadays understand by the term predisposition, natural tendency, the great unknown X factor of patent crawfish, nothing but Hahnemann's Sora, whereas Dr. Emil Segal of Tübingen, a homeopathic physician, gives full recognition to the Sora theory. In Stiegler's opinion, Hahnemann's idea of Sora coincides to a large extent with that of inherited predisposition to disease, weakened condition of individual organs or systems with which our cells center are burdened. This was the time of Virchow's and Koch's view of cellular pathology prevailed in the medical profession. To his opponents, these views of his seem to be even more idiotic than the higher dilution medicines of homeopathy, and for nearly a century they have formed the target of their scornful ridicule. Perhaps now we will be able to recognize the true kernel of enduring value, which enveloped in much that is incomprehensible, vague, untenable, and obsolete, is contained this work by a more than 70-year-old explorer of rare acumen. Hahnemann was not alone in his views of the connection between chronic diseases and expelled itch, the origin of Sora miasm. 2 decades before the appearance of his chronic diseases, Othner Rich, a university professor of Tübingen, had referred to this. According to Hahnemann, there are in Europe only 3 chronic miasms, the diseases of which are distinguished by local symptoms and from which most, if not all, chronic ailments originate. They were psychosis or fifth-ward disease, 2. syphilis or venereal disease, and the third, Sora, which is at the bottom of the itch eruption. It remains as the indisputable merit of Hahnemann that he puts forward his important facts and his own way prove its truth. To him belong, above all, the fame of having discovered the dangers and disadvantages of purely local treatment of external diseases. By his chief merit consists in the fact that he pointed out to his adherent and successor the only way which can lead to a thorough and complete cure of chronic diseases, namely by the use of antisodic remedies, which take into consideration the original side of the disease condition as well as the particular physical constitution of the particular patient. From this point of view, Hahnemann's Sora theory forms, in point of fact, not only a completion of the law of similar, but also an improvement and a perfection of the homeopathic science of healing in general, and indeed the coping stone in Hahnemann's structure of healing. इस अंक में इतना ही, अगले अंक में कुछ और नए फैक्ट हैनीमैन के वर्क और लाइफ के बारे में आगे बढ़ाएंगे। धन्यवाद।